The LEGO Star Wars diorama collection is, in many ways, a slightly diversive idea. On one side of the force, you have fans like me who absolutely love it. The concept of a clean, display-focused LEGO set aimed squarely at adults, something that captures an iconic Star Wars moment and turns it into a tidy little shelf piece, is brilliant. As a kid, I adored both LEGO and Star Wars, but back then the sets were very much toys first and display pieces second. Now, in the 2020s, we're getting builds that feel a bit more grown up. But I do understand the other side of the argument. LEGO is, at the end of the day, a toy. And there are plenty of fans who feel that shelves full of black boxed adult display sets are starting to dominate the range a bit too much. Of course, it's obvious why LEGO have this diorama line. It's money. Adult collectors tend to have more of it, and LEGO is quite fond of charging them for the privilege. Which brings us to this set, the Mos Espa Podrace diorama, LEGO set 75380. The set depicts a snapshot of the fast-paced Tatooine race. Coming in at 718 pieces, it sits in the middle, size-wise, of the Star Wars diorama lineup. Now, within the diorama line, this one has developed something of a reputation as being a weaker entry, and I'll be honest, my first instinct is that I agree. That might be part of the reason why this box has been sitting quietly in my collection, unopened, for quite some time. I actually picked up during the May the 4th promotions a year or two ago. Normally I am not one who buys LEGO sets just to leave them sealed, but every time I looked at this one and thought, should I crack this one open? It just didn't quite spark the same excitement as some of the other dioramas or Star Wars builds. A big part of that, I suspect, is the lack of minifigures and the scaling. This is very much a micro-scale recreation of the pod race, which is cool in theory, but when you combine a micro-scale build with a £75 price tag, it does make you pause for a moment. As the only prequel set in the diorama lineup, I love the idea. Like I said, I love the dioramas, so having one of the pod race is certainly amazing. Although, with so many iconic scenes in the prequels, I do imagine better prequel sets they could have done as dioramas. The closest in the diorama range to this set is probably either the Death Star Trench or the Endor Speeder Bike Chase diorama. That one also captures a fast-moving scene, but the key difference is that it's minifigure scale. You get Luke, Leia, Scout Trooper, and you're right there in the action. With this set, because of the micro-scale approach, you feel a bit more like you're watching the race from a safe distance. As for the box, well, it's exactly what you'd expect from an adult display set. Very clean design, mostly black and fairly understated. Some people find these boxes a bit dull, but I think they suit the diorama collection perfectly. Across the top, we have the Pod Race and Tatooine logo, which is a really nice little graphic actually. And because this set was released during the 25th anniversary of LEGO Star Wars, we get the anniversary branding on the front, including the R2-D2 brick hologram logo. On the side of the box, we actually get a really nice, neat angle of the diorama, looking down the track between the two pod racers, alongside the diorama collection branding, and a 25th anniversary episode 1 icon that has Obi-Wan fighting Darth Maul, which is a nice little nod to the film. Around the back we get another view of the model, which is good, also a blueprint style graphic of the build, and a small still image from the Phantom Menace movie showing Sebulba and Anakin racing. The image does look a little bit slapped on and awkward on the box, but obviously that's not the end of the world. And then we have the top of the box. We again have the Mos Espa Podrace logo on the front. And as always, LEGO gives us that famous 1x1 brick scale for reference. Now, I always find the 1x1 bricks slightly amusing in sets without minifigures. It's useful, of course, but seeing a lonely little 1x1 brick next to a micro-scale pod racer does feel a bit odd, especially because you have to really search for that particular brick on the image. I'm sure including like a more obvious component from the pod racers might have felt a little bit less clunky. Still, it's helpful for scale. LEGO sets often end up being either much larger or much smaller than you expect once they're built. And finally we come to the price. It's £75. Now that's quite a lot of money. You're paying a premium here for the display base and the fact it's part of the diorama collection, but the absence of minifigures at that price point is definitely a sticking point for many people. I did once see someone describe this set as 2 polybags and a bit of tan scenery, which is, to be fair, a pretty dramatic exaggeration, but once you hear that description, it's quite hard to completely unsee it. That said, and despite all of that, I'm genuinely looking forward to building this one and reviewing it. It's been sitting long enough, and it's finally time to see whether it earns its place on the smuggler's shelf. Let's crack open the box and get started. Okay, so build complete, and first impressions, this is actually quite a nice little set. You've got the 2 podracers, admittedly at a much smaller scale than perhaps we're used to with Lego, but they're nicely done. And then surrounding them, you've got this lovely little bit of landscaping. It's dynamic, it's properly 3-dimensional, and that archway in particular really brings the whole thing together. It just makes the set feel more alive. The rockwork feels natural. The terrain has a good sense of movement, and of course it all sits on that classic Lego Star Wars diorama black base plate, which as always looks really premium and fits perfectly alongside the rest of the collection. And straight away, right at the front, you've got the quote from Qui-Gon Jinn. Even just reading it, I can hear Liam Neeson's voice in my head, instant nostalgia. Now, looking a little bit deeper into the set, of course, there are no minifigures here, which is disappointing, especially at this price point. And I think that's going to be a little bit of a running theme throughout this review, that the set itself is good, the price, not so much. Now, it would actually be a bit of an oddity if a minifigure appeared, because we don't tend to see them in diorama sets at this scale. But imagine a small lineup on a little black display stand, Anakin, maybe young Anakin, Qui-Gon, Sebulba, Padme, Watto, almost something like we got with the Jabba sail barge to go alongside just on a little display. That would have gone quite a long way into improving the premium feel of this product. Moving on to the build itself. Now, first thing I'll say, I was actually a little bit disappointed with the instruction booklet itself. It's got this glued spine, and the moment you try to open it flat, which, let's be honest, everyone's going to do because they're building Lego, it starts to crinkle and then tear slightly. You can't really open it flat. I'm no bookbinding expert, so I don't know how you would do this, but this is meant to be a premium set. And even if it wasn't, this just isn't the type of thing that feels particularly satisfying to me. And Lego tend to do things in a quite a satisfying way. So it's just not what you'd expect really from Lego. Not the end of the world. Once you've built the set, the instructions probably go back on the box or away. But it does just feel like a very easy thing Lego could improve on. In the instructions before the build begins, you do get a few pages of content. There's a short intro from the Lego Star Wars creative director, alongside a slightly blurry still from the Phantom Menace. And then you get a bit of background on the pod race itself. There are a couple of quotes included on these pages. One from Anakin saying, I'm building a pod racer. And then you also get another one, which is presumably the commentators on the race. So Sebulba takes the lead, followed closely by Skywalker, both of which feel like they could have easily ended up on the quote plaque instead of the Qui-Gon quote. So maybe those were in the runnings. I am actually happy with the one they chose. I love that quote. So yeah, in my opinion, good choice for the front quote for this display piece. The display piece is printed, which is always nice. And then you also get a page celebrating the 25th anniversary of Lego Star Wars, which matches the R2-D2 hologram style brick. And then you also get a little advert for the Lego Star Wars book, which we'll politely skip past. So, into the build. You get 6 numbered bags in total and a small shiny parts bag. You also get 2 large dark tan plates and your trusty brick separator. Bag 1 starts things off with the black base, very familiar territory if you've built any of the dioramas before. And to be fair, I do like these bases. They're clean, they're consistent, and they make the set feel like a proper display piece. And then you lay down the large tan plates to form the ground. At first, it does look a little bit too neat with these dark tan large plates. because they're in straight rows of studs in what's meant to be a natural desert. But once everything's built up, you genuinely don't notice it. If anything, it adds to the overall clean look of the set once you've got the other bits of environment placed down. And I've got to say, when it comes to building the terrain, it's actually quite enjoyable. It never really gets boring, which is always a danger when you're building up basically rock and terrain. So that's surprising. But in most Lego sets, the environment is the afterthought, if it exists at all, whereas here it is the main event. You spend much longer building the terrain than any of the individual pod racers. You're building the world first and then placing the action into it. That said, I do suspect this is the sort of thing that kids might enjoy a little bit less, and so that's it, leaning heavily into that adult set idea, focusing more on the atmosphere and environment than the play. Bag 2 introduces us to the back wall, and there's some really satisfying snock building here, and once that's in place, it gives off a bit of a Last Crusade desert temple vibe, which I wasn't expecting, but I quite liked. You also start adding small studs and pieces along the ground, breaking up the flatness and sort of representing little wisps of sand that are presumably getting kicked up by the pod racers. Bag 3 builds out that side rock work. Again, lots of snot techniques, but it never really gets dull because you're building them in sections. Attaching each one to the wall is genuinely quite satisfying. And then you also place a rotating element here, which will eventually hold this arch. And it's a clever little bit of design because it lets the arch sit at that slightly unnatural angle rather than a rigid 90 degrees. It's a small detail, but it actually makes such a big difference in making the scene feel dynamic. Overall, the rock work is just really well done. It's a proper diorama, not just a base with vehicles stuck on top. Bag 4 is where we start to build Anakin's pod racer. Initially, it does feel like one of those small early 2000s mini builds. I've got one of them here from 2003 Sebulbas. You use some of the similar pieces as well, the same horizontal bar representing that energy beam that goes across, and those elements which just have studs on all faces. It really did just give the vibe of those polybag or early mini build Lego sets. But as it comes together, it becomes much more detailed. There are also little moments of nostalgia as well, particularly when you're building parts of the engines that you recognise from the film. There are bits that the camera zooms in on in the pod race, and you can almost picture the scene as you're putting it together. Some of the bits of Anakin's pod racer that start to fail, and therefore you get those close-ups in the movie. You see them as you're putting the pod racer together, which was lovely. One odd thing here is that there's an entire bag of metallic pieces included in this set, and you barely use any of them. By the end of the build, you're left with quite a large amount of spare pieces. This is only some of them. Quite a lot in each of the pod racer specific numbered bags, so slightly odd there. Lego, of course, always include little extras for the smaller parts in each set, but this felt a little bit excessive. You also get our first stickers here. I'm not usually someone that actually complains about stickers too much, but at this price point for a premium adult set, I really would have preferred printed pieces. The design of the stickers are quite clean. They're maybe a little bit too clean in the sense that the pod racers in the film, they're battered, worn, slightly rough around the edges, whereas these feel fresh out of a showroom. To be fair, the rest of the set is quite clean as well, so maybe overly weathered sticker designs might have looked a bit out of place. The cockpit section for Anakin's pod racer is slightly asymmetrical, which is a bit odd. It's not a huge issue, just noticeable as you're building it, so bear that in mind if you feel like that's something that might annoy you. And once it's finished, the whole thing feels slightly rickety, but weirdly, I don't mean that in a bad way. It actually matches how Anakin's pod racer looks and feels in the film, like it's barely holding itself together, especially those front paddles, which use like old ski elements, I think, and they wobble just enough to sell that effect. You're not going to break it unless you actively try, but it feels fragile, and I think that actually works. That said, there's no getting away from it. this does feel like a polybag scale build. And again, £75 starts creeping back into your mind. Once attached to the diorama though, it looks fantastic. From certain angles, especially from looking from behind, you really get that sense of the scene from the film. Lots of nostalgia coming back. Anakin himself is represented by a single stud, which is just par for the course and part of the compromise at this scale. And importantly, the way the model is mounted does a great job of hiding the support, so it really does look like it's hovering. The angle of the pod racer is slightly steeper than I would have chosen, but it does add to that sense of motion. Bag 5 brings us to Sebulba's pod racer. Now this one feels much chunkier straight away. You've got those big orange engines. They really stand out. Now the stickers here, they're not great. Because of the way Lego stickers are sized, you always get this visible orange border, and on a piece that's meant to just be half black, half orange, it just looks wrong. It's one of those rare moments where even I, somebody who doesn't usually mind stickers, notices it immediately. And when that happens, you know it's not ideal. Again, printed pieces would have made a really big difference here. The build itself is also quite clean. Again, maybe too clean compared to the film. You almost want a little bit of grime, a little bit of damage, explosion marks, something to reflect how chaotic and violent the pod race is. But at this scale, there's only so much detail you can include. So I wouldn't necessarily dock points there. It's just difficult to add any sort of detail in a scale this big. Now, slightly embarrassingly, I did actually struggle with some of the instructions here. For the first time, I've struggled with Lego instructions in years. There's a step involving the aligning of the bar, and if you don't get that just right, the whole thing ends up slightly wonky or just like falls apart, which is just quite fiddly. Which does again lean into the fact that this is an adult set, and therefore they can take little liberties with making it a bit fiddlier, in exchange for having a little bit more detail or a little bit more of a complex build. It's not that complex, it's just something I just happen to struggle with a little bit with this one. And it's not actually something you typically expect from Lego instructions, which are usually incredibly forgiving. I did get there in the end. Second attempt, it was fine, but it was just surprising. There's also an interesting design choice with the energy binders between the engines. You get the pink energy beam, but also this transparent support bar. Personally, I would have actually loved it if they could have made it work with just the pink beam. And even better, maybe even have this as a slightly jagged lightning style beam. Something closer to the kind of like energy effects we see from some of Emperor Palpatine's lightning bolts, just in pink. I think that would have looked fantastic because of the sort of electrical style of the energy beam that we see in the film. Once both races are placed into the scene though, they really come to life. The colours pop, the composition works, and it's instantly recognisable. Despite their small size, they actually do exactly what they need to do. If you were asked to build a micro-scale diorama of a pod race, this is a fantastic go at it. I couldn't think of how it could be improved on that front. Finally, Bag 6 finishes off the front of the landscape, and thankfully these don't feel like filler pieces. Every extra piece feels like it adds something, more texture, more depth, more movement. It doesn't feel like Lego's sort of throwing pieces in there just to try and bump up and justify a higher price. And then we complete the arch, which again is just such a key part of this set. It adds height, it adds structure, and it's a nice inclusion because flying through the arches is one of the more memorable sections of the pod race track. So to get it in the Lego set is really nice. My only minor gripe is that the top of the arch feels a bit flat. It's just two stud widths consistently across the entire top, whereas the rest of the rockwork is much more dynamic and natural. But because it's angled, you don't really notice it too much. It's odd that Sebulba's pod racer wouldn't actually fit through the arch itself that it's clearly meant to have just come from. It's very odd, but you honestly don't notice it. You have to really look and be studying it in order to find little nitpick things like that. However, just be aware, as if that's the type of thing your brain might latch onto and get annoyed at, then be warned. And so, what are my final thoughts? This is actually a really good Lego set. The environment is excellent, display value very high, and once it's built, it looks quite fantastic. If you bear in mind what Lego was going for here with the design, for a diorama of a pod race, you really get what you asked for. The pod races themselves, they're a bit underwhelming to build. They do feel like scaled up polybags, and I do think they would have been far more enjoyable slightly larger. Of course, though, that would have meant that the whole diorama would have had to be bigger. I'm not sure what the ideal size would have been, but you're compromising a slightly worse build experience for a really cool display set. And so the overall presentation, really, really good, which is what you're looking for with a diorama set. However, £75. And that's where everything changes, because without that £75 price tag, this would be an easy recommendation. But with the price, it just leaves that bit of a sour taste when you think about it. I would argue this isn't even a case of slightly overpriced, and therefore you have to weigh up whether it's worth the money. I would say that the price actually ruins this set. It's a good Lego set ruined by the price tag. If this were cheaper when it came out, I think people would look at it much more favourably. It is a good set, but because you see it next to that £75 price tag, expectations for what £75 should buy you goes up, and it just doesn't quite meet them. And then suddenly, everyone's view of this set is that we have a diorama, which many people therefore describe as a bad Lego set. In my opinion, it's not a bad set, it's just terrible for that price. So you hear the £75, and that's tarnished almost the reputation of this set. So the final verdict, if you're a fan of the prequels, pod racing, or the diorama collection, then this is a really nice piece to add to your display. From a shelf display point of view, I'm really happy. I'm certainly going to be displaying it alongside my other sets. But if you're going to pick it up, just make sure you get it at a good price. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe if you enjoy this style of review, and I'll see you next time.